Hello. Welcome to North Country History. This is Rob Berg, and today we're going to continue talking about the lumbermen who went to war during the First World War, the 10th and 20th Engineer Regiments that were made up of foresters. I talked about Edward Hartwick in part 1 earlier this week, and I didn't have a chance to be able to finish with part 2 in the same episode, so we're concluding with that one today. So sit back, settle in, and enjoy the show. North Country History with Rob Berg, your podcast on the forest history of the Great Lakes region. On April 6, 1917, the United States finally declared war on Germany and entered into the First World War. The war had been going on since July of 1914, so the United States entrance was rather late compared to the rest of the belligerents that were involved in the war. Britain and France, the main allies fighting on the Western Front, really needed the help of the Americans, and not only for soldiers fighting in the front lines, but also for a lot of support services. And this included for the supplying of lumber and the construction of fortifications such as trenches and dugouts, along with support buildings, barracks, hospitals, and what would be surprisingly to many people is ice houses. This was not a time of a lot of mass refrigeration, so the way to keep things cold that were necessary, such as medicines and food and water and other types of materials like that, was through the use of ice. And the construction of ice houses that could both manufacture ice, but also, more importantly, store ice, was very important. So these were jobs that would be needed, and this was something that was turned over to men in the armies called the engineers. And it was not something that was new. The First World War was not the first war to use engineers. Engineers had been going back for centuries, designing fortifications, forts, constructing them, and then everything needed to go along with it, the building of bridges, of roads, of anything that was necessary for construction work in armies was done by the engineers. One particular type of engineers, though, that came about during the First World War was the use of foresters. And those would be people involved professionally in logging, in planting of trees, in different types of construction work. And we had a lot of those here in the United States. The lumber industry was still going quite strong in most areas of the country here by the mid-1910s. Michigan, it was on a decline, but there was still enough of them around, of lumbermen, to fill out the ranks that were needed. And this also includes the other Great Lakes states, Minnesota and Wisconsin, but also those logging in the West, in Washington and Oregon and California, back east still in Maine and Vermont, New England area, New York, Pennsylvania, and lumbermen in the South, stretching from the Carolinas, North and South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, into Arkansas, Texas. All of this region would have been areas where they would have been doing a lot of logging still, Tennessee and Kentucky in the mountains. So this was a job where there were a lot of men employed, and it was a great need in the Army, so there was a lot of available manpower. And then they would need men who were involved in the profession to lead them, such as Edward Hartwick, as I mentioned in the previous episode. He was an experienced lumberman on the business side of it in Detroit, but having grown up in Grayling, right on the front lines of the lumber industry in Michigan, and his father-in-law having been a major member of a large lumbering firm in Grayling and in Michigan as well. So it was something that he was, knew of firsthand. So when he finally was able to enlist in the Army, it was a perfect fit for him to become a major of the engineers in the 1st Battalion of the 20th Engineer Regiment. So when they first decided that this was going to be needed, they looked at just having one engineering or one forestry regiment of engineers, and that was designated as the 10th Regiment of Engineers. And the call for lumbermen and foresters to volunteer went out in May of that year in 1917. And by July, the 10th Engineers were training at Camp American University. American University is located in Washington, D.C., and they had an Army camp for training set up on the grounds of the college there, right in the District of Columbia. And this would also then be the location where the 20th Engineers would come and train there just a couple of months later. The engineers, as I mentioned, were in great need, and they were accelerated in their training to get men over to France as soon as possible. And with the training began in July, as I mentioned, and it was September 9th, just 2 months later, that the 10th Engineers would leave Camp American University and set sail on the Carpathia, the ship that helped rescue some of the survivors of the Titanic in 1912. But the Carpathia was turned into a transport ship, and the 10th Engineers set sail on that, first initially to Scotland, and then on October 9th, they arrived in France to establish their camps. A month later, the 20th Engineers would leave France on, of all days, November 11th, 1 year prior to the armistice, the ending of the war, which would be November 11th, 1918. And the 1st and 2nd Battalions left for France. And they arrived on November 25th, or 26th. I see one 25th, and Edward Hartwick's papers say 26. So either day that they arrived there in France and began work to help with the tents, to start logging in southern France and constructing fortifications, buildings, doing all the work that they would need to do. As I mentioned in the previous episode, they did a lot of road building and laying railroad grades and tracks because they had to transport the lumber to the sawmill, just like in the lumber industry here in the United States. So it was a very important job, as mentioned. And the men that did the work, yes, they had to be trained for military training, but most of them had been already involved in the lumber industry. So the work itself was coming second, was second nature to them with that. The 10th Regiment of Engineers consisted of a total of about 1,062 men. It was broken down into the 2 battalions, the 1st Battalion and the 2nd Battalion. Each battalion consisted of 3 companies. Each company had 164 men in the company. They also both had a headquarters staff, 26 men each. And then there was the regimental headquarters staff, also of 26 men each. So the breakdown of all of that was to 1,062 men, as I mentioned. And that was typical of a regiment at the time. Some regiments might include 3 battalions. That's what they grew to, certainly by the time of World War II, were 3 battalions. But this one was 2 battalions. And it was dwarfed by its sister regiment, the 20th. When that was created, it would consist of 10 regiments. Sorry, not 10 regiments, 10 battalions. So instead of 1,000 men, we're looking at something around 10,000 men in the battalion or in the regiment. I think actually it was somewhere between or right around 9,000 was the number for the 20th Regiment. Because when they got there and started the work, and that their work really began setting up with the sawmills, constructing everything, they kicked off the work, the 10th did, with their first sawmills established operating on November 25th of 1917, the same day of arrival that the 20th Regiment would begin to arrive. But they started with 3 sawmills. 2 of them were sawmills that were brought on board the Carpathia, and it took time for them to get transferred to France. And then a 3rd sawmill was a French sawmill that they took over. And that wasn't bad for, 1,000 men operating 3 sawmills, but also doing the forestry work out in the woods, the lumbermen, the lumberjacks, as we call them now, cutting the trees down, then transporting the lumber by road and railroad to the sawmills. And then, of course, once the lumber was finished, they would have to then construct materials or whatever their needs were. As I mentioned, the barracks, hospitals, fortifications, lumber sent to the front to construct the trenches, work like that. But to show how much was necessary, by the end of the war, by October of 1918, or end of October, not quite the end, November 11th, as I mentioned, will be the end. But as of October 31st, 1918, instead of 3 mills being operated, there were 81 mills in operation. And the troop strength of the Forestry Regiment, I say regiment because by October of 1918, the 10th Regiment had been absorbed into the 20th Regiment, and giving it a total troop strength of 360 officers and 18,183 enlisted men. It was by far the largest regiment, Army regiment in the world, not just in the American Army, but in the world. This was really the size of a division, which would be the next, or the largest amount or sized unit of men in the Army would be a division. And that usually consisted of 2 or 3 regiments incorporated into it. So it was large. And as I mentioned, they did a lot of work. Some of that work was, same as what they were doing in the United States, the logging, the cutting of the trees, and then of the manufacturing of the lumber, milling it into the finished product. But then that also included the construction work. So they weren't all just foresters, all loggers, but they had a wide variety involved in all of that. Thankfully, Edward Hartwick, Major Edward Hartwick of Grayling and Detroit, left a great diary of documenting what he did in the First World War. He also did the same with his life or with his work in the Spanish-American War when he was in the cavalry that I mentioned in the first part of this double episode. But in his diary, which much of it was later published as part of the privately printed, privately published biography of Major Edward E. Hartwick, written by Gordon K. Miller in 1921. And I own a reprint of that biography, also, as I mentioned, in the first part of this double episode. But he does a great description of what was being done in France and what conditions they arrived in. In a letter to his family, he wrote on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1917. So I'm going to read some of this that's in his biography. This day and yesterday have been for me too busy in order to enjoy them as Christmas Eve and day should be. However, I have finally shut myself up alone to spend the rest of the afternoon with my own little family circle. I suppose we are more than 3,000 miles apart in actual distance, yet in thought I am trying to fancy that you are in the room with me and that I am to hear from Mother, Nelson, and Robert how they passed Christmas Eve, and whether the little souvenirs I sent arrived on time. But since you are not really here, it will be for me to tell you or tell my story and first and later on read yours, though I have not had a letter from anyone yet. It is the same with my adjutant, Captain Pill. As I said in letter number 10, it would be a few days before I would have a chance to write again. Since then, I have traveled more than 200 miles in a Ford. All hail the Ford. And 2 days besides in an antique French machine, and 1 day additional in our own little auto ambulance, also a Ford. These French roads are everywhere splendid. Otherwise, I might not be so enthusiastic about the Ford. Our own transportation has not yet reached us, and judging from the celerity of delivery of everything else, it will be at least a month before it does. But in the meantime, we have one little Ford Red Cross ambulance received at our port of landing. Arrived here on the 18th after a most interesting, if chilly, auto drive over perfect roads in width of pavement like our concrete roads, but with about 10 feet additional of good earth road on either side. As a rule, the grand routes are bordered on each side with trees of either sycamore, whose boughs meet in the middle of the road, or the fringe is a border of cork oak, and which are generally denuded of the bark for about 6 or 7 feet from the ground. The bark is regularly stripped for cork, and in due time it grows out again. 100 or so years ago, this country was a wide expanse of sand and sandy morass, a desert. But about that time, experiments were made with a view of growing a forest of pineland, and after years of trial and discouragement, the successful methods were found so that the woods are of trees from 50 to 70 years, a species of pine resembling in appearance our jack pine, but growing 50 to 60 feet high and with limbs about 30 feet from the ground. The thrift of the people. All the ferns, just like our brakes, I think he means the bracken ferns, and moss and brambles are gathered annually, mixed with manure, and put back on the farms for fertilizer. The tree is cut level with the ground, and the limbs down to 2 feet for wood, and the balance gathered in baskets. Manure here passes for currency, same as in the Black Forest. Our 2 camps expect to have a nice fund for the purchase of knickknacks, and which will be derived from the sale of manure. Also, we are going to get some piglets and grow them on our kitchen refuse, and sell them at a profit and buy more piglets, etc., etc. The day I drove out to inspect F Company camp, it was snowing, and I'm sure if you had been with me, you would have pitied and yet admired the fortitude of this French womanhood. The roughest and hardest kind of work, no men to do it. Girls of 14, bare head and bare hands, repairing the road in the snowstorm. Others at work chopping wood and driving oxen. Old women, bent and worn, and boys from 7 to 15, but no able-bodied men, only old men and men from the front invalid. Women on the railroads, section gangs. They drive for 120 miles. The drive for 120 miles was through these maritime pine forests, broken only now and then by a little old quaint and curious hamlet, but splendid roads. And we will tour them together when the war is over. The first day after arriving here was spent in getting a general idea of our timber and camp, mill locations, sidings, etc. The timber had already been bought by our Forestry Service, but we must build our mills, permanent camps, stables, logging roads, side tracks, and wagon roads. The second and third days were spent in going to F Company at Houlier. I probably am not pronouncing that correctly. And on the 21st, my 2 companies, A and C, and headquarters arrived, but not in time to detrain them until the morning of the 22nd. We had previously rented a motor truck and one other arrived from the 10th Engineers with some gasoline so that after taking the men off the trains in the morning, we had both companies at their campsites, one 4 miles and one 5 miles, and the noon meal cooked on our army ovens. By night, their tents were up, their stoves inside, and fires going. The French officers could hardly believe it, for each company numbered 200 men, or 240 men, 250 originally, and each had 3 baggage cars of property. They were a happy bunch of men and glad to get to work, to hear the sound of the axe and saw and fall of the tree. Both camps are, of course, right in the woods. All the French officials were by appointment at the station to see us march out, and before I could begin to do anything, it was necessary that I call society. Let me try this one over. All the French officials were by appointment at the station to see us march out, and before I could begin to do anything, it was necessary that I called socially on all. The prefecture, the commandant de army, the mayor, the sous-mayor, under-mayor, and the medicine chief, senior surgeon, the chief de guerre, superintendent of railroads, the chief gendarme, chief of police, and finally the owner of the timber. They are all without exception most charming to meet, but beginning with yesterday, they have been returning my calls. I forgot the chef de poste, the postmaster. I think you may realize that I have been, these past 7 days, quite busy with all of these social stunts added to the regular work. On the trip to Houlier, we stopped overnight at a village, the capital of this district, Department of Landis, Mont-de-Marsan. And when we take the tour after the war, I hope we may be in it on a market day and view the country folk coming into town through the alley-like streets and taking up their stations on the sidewalk, where they spread out their wares for sale. It was really like that stage setting in the Garden of Allah. I think that is a special play where the cart drawn by the donkeys, the camels, the burden bearers, etc., filed by. At Mont-de-Marsan, all that was missing for a duplicate of the setting were the camels. The greatest market day of the year, the Saturday before Christmas, was the day our men arrived. So I was too busy to notice it, but all of the country folk, their chickens, ducks, geese, pigs, cows, and best produce and homemade articles were from miles around located in 2 streets bordering the park. This town, Dax, is a very well-known watering place, and this hotel is such a grand one that I hardly feel that it is appropriate for me and my staff to stop here in wartime. But it is such a contrast to the huts in which we were quartered at St. Nazaire. There we had earth floors and no doors and no heat, and then to be translated to this establishment. Captain Pill and I are rooming together, and when I showed him the room, he exclaimed, "Well, Major, the horrors of war will be when we have to leave this place. This place is something on the order of Mount Clemens, only the water are not sulfur." That would be Mount Clemens, Michigan, was a nice spa town at one time. They flow in immense volume and are hot. The springs where Caesar used to take his bath are surrounded by a rectangular ornamental wall with iron-grated windows through which you can see the crystal water with a perpetual cloud of steam arising. Skip down a little bit here. I have my headquarters in the town and one company on one side about 4 miles away, and the other on another side about 5 miles distant. The headquarters detachment, about 40 men, are encamped where do you think? Well, I got permission to pitch our tents in the arena, a Spanish bull ring surrounded with raised seats, all constructed of concrete, similar to our ballpark, except the diameter of the ring is only about 150 feet. But it is the best camping place we will ever get. My men have just picked up a man in the uniform of a Canadian, and he is either demented or a spy, so I sent him to the town Bastille and will soon have to go and investigate him. Just advise that tomorrow we get 20 sacks of mail. I have not had a letter from you yet. If those 20 sacks fail to have several, I will be disappointed. I heard also that our boat, the Madawaska, had not sailed on the 20th, so the long first letter I wrote will not reach you for some days yet. This has not been like Christmas for us. I tried to make it a little like it last night. I gave a dinner to my staff and the 2 company commanders, 10 of us. We had roast turkey and plum pudding, and the plum and pudding was real home-like. but there was not much jollity at the table, and I know that everyone's heart was back somewhere in the States. So, as you can see, the letter home does describe a bit of the conditions of where they were, their camps were at, and some of the initial setups that they had to do. The falling of the trees was particularly the most important job yet, along with setting up their camps. In another letter that Edward Hartwick sent home, he mentions that the first sawmill to get started was the B Company mill, and they have been running since January 5th and shipped their first car of lumber to the front the day I was with them. They are located near our central supply station, and so we're able to get the machinery. It was a French-manufactured sawmill, the first one they had operating. Cars are so scarce here that if the rest of the companies wait for American mills, it will be about March 1 before we are sawing. However, I am trying to buy or rent some French mills. If I do, we will be grinding out boards within a couple of weeks as at the two other companies. In Hartwick's biography by Gordon Miller, there is mention of more of the work that was done. Major Hartwick and his men were delayed in beginning the actual operation of sawing lumber by the failure of the American mills to arrive, as was mentioned in his letter. Each battalion was supposed to have had a complete outfit for logging and sawmill operations. Small mills were purchased from the French, however, and regular work was done until the arrival of the American machinery in March of 1918. The 20th also laid many miles of railroad track and sidings for troop trains. Shortly before his death, Major Hartwick was engaged in the construction of ice houses, the largest for the manufacture and storing of ice in the history of the industry. The lumber for these was taken by the engineers from a 50-year-old forest. The First World War ended on November 11th, 1918, with the signing of the armistice that ceased the hostilities of the war. The war actually would not officially end until 1919 with the signing of the Paris Treaty, but the Treaty of Paris, I mean. However, some troops were sent home as soon as hostilities were over, and these included the two battalions that made up the original 10th Regiment of Engineers. They were sent home, and after that, though, operations did resume because the rest of the engineers were then involved were involved in helping to reconstruct France after the war had ended. There was not a whole lot of work after 1919. Most of the troops were sent home in that year. And in 1920, as mentioned in the part one, that was when many of the war dead, including those who died of disease, including Edward Hartwick, bodies began to be exhumed and returned home for burial, though not all who died in France. Their bodies were sent back home. Many stayed in American military cemeteries in France itself. Today's episode, along with Monday's episode on Edward Hartwick, shows just a glimpse that those who went to war, not everybody were fighters, were the men fighting in combat on the front lines. As armies always consisted of more than just the frontline troops, but there were a lot of support troops necessary. Engineers, and in earlier forms, they were called artificers and pioneers. They were doing a lot of the work of building fortifications, clearing land, important but very much unsung work. And also, more men, at least through World War I, died of disease than they did of wounds caused in battle. And Edward Hartwick's death of cerebral spinal meningitis on March 31, 1918, was just one example of all of that. And so this week, as we commemorate Memorial Day, The Monday earlier this week, it was the official observance of Memorial Day, but for more than a century, it was recognized as Memorial Day was May 30th. So we're coming up on that tomorrow. So I thought this was a fitting time to talk about some of those men, the woodsmen who went to war. You had the foresters, the lumberjacks, you had sawmill operators, sawyers, mechanics. They were all needed to fight the Germans on the Western Front, at least for the American involvement, 1917 and 1918, but for the British and the French, starting in 1914, and other allies, the Italians fighting the Austro-Hungarians and the Ottoman Empire, the Russians on the Eastern Front fighting Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Turks. So this was a very important part of the war that most people forget. And this was not the only time that lumbermen went to war. During the American Civil War, that also was the situation. Most of them, though, served in infantry regiments or other regiments fighting against the Confederacy, and in the South, those that were Confederates fighting against the Federal troops. But most of them, were combat fighters. Very few of them were engineers. It was not a large segment of the Army at the time. And Michigan had its own engineer and mechanics regiment that did include some lumbermen. And in a future Memorial Day broadcast, maybe we can discuss about the engineering regiment from Michigan. And if I can get a hold of my old boss, Mark Hoffman, who was the deputy director of the Michigan Department of History, Arts, and Libraries, he wrote the book on that. So, Mark, if you're listening, I hope that we can reconnect here sometime in the future and be able to discuss your book, which I think was a fascinating read. So, but for the rest of you, thank you for listening today. And remember, we will be starting season 2 in just a few days. Today is Thursday, May 29th, and we will be starting our new season on Monday, June 2nd. So just 5 days away. So thanks for listening, and hope you stay with us for the coming season, the second season. And as always, if you like this episode, please tell a friend, pass on the word. It's the best way for us to expand. I'm closing in on 700 downloads of the podcast. So a pretty good amount of people are getting connected to it, and I just want to help keep it growing. So thank you, and keep listening. I'll be talking to you again soon. Bye. North Country History with Rob Berg is hosted, written, and produced by Rob Berg. Music is Crack o' Dawn, performed by Reveille, licensed through Soundstripe. Follow North Country History with Rob Berg on YouTube and on Facebook at Rob Berg, Environmental Historian.